As I have talked about with some of you before, we are in year B of the liturgical calendar. This means that we are reading the Gospel of Mark on most Sundays. In year A, we read Matthew, year B, Mark, and year C, Luke. Now, the Gospel of John is very different from the other three. So we read and reread the same readings from John each year on certain holy days. And we also read a lot of John in year B. The reason we read a lot of John in year B is because Mark is by far the shortest of the Gospels. Mark does not have a lot of details in his version. He gets to the point very quickly and moves on. So in today's gospel, we read that Jesus taught with authority, not like the scribes, but the substance of what Jesus taught is left out. It would seem that this would be something that Mark might want to have included. So why didn't he? Well, I think the clue may be in our first reading today from Deuteronomy. Moses had promised that there would be prophets coming after him. The prophets would be chosen by God to speak on behalf of God. And if anyone presumed to speak as a prophet who was not chosen by God, that person would be struck down. So over the 1500 years between Moses and Jesus, again and again, prophets were called by God to speak on behalf of God, particularly in times of crisis. But there were also priests and scribes, men who by their family lineage inherited the role of leading worship, studying scriptures, and reiterating the interpretation of scriptures that had become accepted over time. The priests and scribes provided the accepted interpretations and taught from a place of recitation. They were not prophets, and they knew that they were not prophets, and they did not pretend to be prophets. But Jesus, as much as we believe he was so much more beyond being a prophet, also followed in the line of the prophets. And most of what he said wasn't new. God's message during the time of Moses was to love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. And God's message in the time of the former prophets was to love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. And God's message in the time of the latter prophets was to love God with all your heart and love your neighbors as yourself. And God's message in the time of Jesus was to love God with all your heart and love your neighbors as yourself. Now, certainly, there was something unique to Jesus. Other prophets drove out demons, but they did so with elaborate ceremonies, not by simply commanding a spirit to come out. No other prophet spoke of eating his flesh and drinking his blood for the forgiveness of sins. And with the exception of Jonah and Daniel, the prophets' messages were usually directed exclusively to the communities of Israel and Judea, whereas Jesus' message was meant for the entire world. Jesus was the Word made incarnate, unique in all of human history. But the prophetic message of Jesus that Luke and Matthew expound upon, the message that Jesus preached throughout his ministry, and no doubt the message that he proclaimed in the synagogue of Capernaum, was very much the same message that God had commanded the prophets to speak for 1500 years. Love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. And 2000 years later, this remains our call. Amen.